Today, Alternative Views will interview Pete Bruton concerning his book, The Mafia, CIA, and George Bush. Pete is a former Houston Post reporter who broke the story of the connections between the S&L scandal and the CIA, exposing how CIA assets would borrow money from the S&Ls to finance off-the-book operations and then declare bankruptcy and leave U.S. taxpayers with the bill. Well, for the past 5 years, Pete has been tracking down who actually profited from the S&L scam, who the main players were, and how they skimmed off their money. Lo and behold, Pete discovered that the beneficiaries of the S&L scandals were friends of George Bush and his family, unsavory folks connected to the CIA and Mafia, as well as associates of Texas big shots such as Senator Lloyd Bentsen and Houston power broker Walter Mischer. Well, obviously, this is an explosive story, and today we are going to explore the full ramifications of the S&L crisis with author Pete Bruton, who's now a law student here at the University of Texas.
So the Reagan-Bush administration and Congress decided that they were going to deregulate, quote-unquote, savings and loans, and this allowed S&Ls to basically invest their money and lend their money on anything they wanted to.
Chapter of your book called The Mobsters, Spooks, and George Bush, the Palmer National Bank story, that ties all these things that we're talking about together. In other words, the way that high-level officials with connections to the government, corporate and political officials, formed a bank, the Palmer National Bank, and how it became connected with all these unsavory operations. Do you want to give us some detail on this to sort of concretely illustrate this analysis?
The Palmer National Bank had just about everybody in it. It was a small bank, still exists in Washington, D.C., about 2 blocks north of the White House. It was started by a Louisiana businessman named Harvey McLean and a political operative from Washington, D.C. called Stephen Halper. And McLean and Halper met in 1980 when they were both working on George Bush's presidential campaign. And Halper later was head of the policy group for Bush. And then when Reagan became the nominee and Bush was named vice presidential candidate, Halper went to work for their campaign as part of the policy group and was actually a high-level official in what they called the October Surprise Group, the group that was trying to determine whether or not Carter was going to pull off an October surprise and get the Iranian hostages home or whatever. And Halper was in charge of this group. His father-in-law was Ray Klein, who was the former deputy director of intelligence of the CIA. Klein was working with them, with Bush. And then when Reagan and Bush won, Halper went to work for the State Department. They created a position for him. And James Baker, by the way, was the one that brought Halper over to the Reagan-Bush team after Reagan became the nominee from the Bush team. So, and Harvey McLean was a businessman from Shreveport, Louisiana, and he was being financed by none other than Herman K. Beebe, the Mafia associate. McLean moves to Dallas and buys Paris Savings and Loan in Paris, Texas, and is borrowing money from Vernon Savings, from Continental Savings in Houston, and later, of course, all these loans go bad and Paris goes bust, and McLean's business deals cost taxpayers probably over $100 million. That's kind of getting ahead of the story. Back in '83, McLean and Halper are taking a trip to China, and they start talking about, let's get a bank in Washington, D.C., and so they start Palmer National Bank. Palmer was named after McLean's grandmother and daughter. And the capital, the $3 million capital to start the bank, came from Herman K. Beebe and Bossier Bank and Trust.
The guy connected to the mob in Louisiana.
Right.
He seems to be everywhere.
And to Mischer, and to Ben Barnes, John Connolly, all these people. So as soon as they start this bank, they begin lending money to conservative Republican PACs like Bob Dole and Jack Kemp. And then they take on another client, the National Endowment for the Preservation of Liberty, which was started by Oliver North and a guy named Spitz Channel to funnel private donations to the Contras. Okay, and of course the biggest donor was Ellen Garwood here in Austin, the widow of the former Supreme Court Justice. And Palmer National Bank was also lending money to the National Endowment for operating loans and for furniture loans, and helping funnel the money. That's where they had the bank the money would go from Palmer National Bank to another Washington bank to the Cayman Islands, and then over to Geneva, Switzerland, in the bank account at Credit Suisse, where not only was Contra money being flowed into, but Iranian arms profits were also being...
Secord was operating.
Yes, that was Secord's, and then it would go out to the Contras, and Palmer was the starting point of the money. And Palmer National Bank also made a loan on a beach house in Solano Beach, California, that BB and Dixon would use to entertain S&L regulators, including L.L. Bowman. In fact, that's where he allegedly had a tryst with a prostitute in that beach house. And Palmer National Bank had a piece of the action on that beach house. And later, Stephen Halper was, when he got caught in the DebateGate scandal, if you recall that, the theft of the Carter debating manuals that ended up in the Reagan-Bush campaign that apparently James Baker or William Casey or both of them were involved in.
And that was just part of an enormous covert action against the Carter administration, which they had something like 137 operatives at all kinds of high levels, spying, snooping, and even stealing top secret documents. And this is just one of their operations.
That's correct. Well, Halper was involved in that, and he, of course, his name surfaced in 1984 when this came out, and he had to sort of leave. He kind of backed out of Palmer National Bank. But he stayed in touch with these people, of course. And then when Oliver North was fired by Reagan in November 1986, when the scheme where they were, using profits from the Iranian arms deals to fund the Contras, and it all came tumbling out, and Reagan fired North, the very last entry in Oliver North's White House diaries was legal defense firm Stephen Halper, our old Palmer National Bank guy.
Who also, again, I want to make this October surprise connection, because Halper was the head of the October surprise committee for the Reagan election team in 1980, which was frightened to death that the Carter administration was going to negotiate the release of the hostages, which may be one of the reasons why they stole the debate book, as well as did these other covert actions against Carter, because they wanted to find out what he was doing for this hostage release, and if possible subvert it and give the Iranians a better deal. At least that's the account that Gary Sick and others give.
That's correct. And Scott was in the middle of it.
And how it worked out that way. They rigged a deal so that the Iranians would hold the hostages until after the election and in return for arms. And lo and behold, 20 minutes after Reagan raised his hand and said that he would ruin the country, the hostages were released.
Well, and here we have this little bank, that was involved in all this, being financed with Louisiana Mafia money. And when Herman K. Beebe was first convicted in 1985, of course, they moved that loan out of Bossier Bank to a little savings and loan in Beaumont, Texas, called San Jacinto Savings, different from San Jacinto in Houston. And if you look at the board members of that bank, you find two people who were major stockholders in the casinos, Caesars Casino in Las Vegas, that of course was being skimmed by the Chicago Mafia at that time.
So it's absolutely incredible how all this is connected. October Surprise, Iran-Contra, SNL, Mafia, CIA, all of this, William Casey, all of these operations under the Reagan administration were interconnected, as well as the players.